Lecture 11.1 will cover the anatomy of the heart, and essentially we're going to be talking about heart structures and the path of blood flow. So in the next lecture, 11.2, is when I will talk about the heart physiology. The heart is enclosed by a pericardium, and this is a double serous membrane. So if you remember back from earlier in the year, serous membranes have two layers. The inner layer is called the visceral, in this case pericardium because it's surrounding the heart, and then the outer layer is the parietal pericardium. Serous fluid fills the space in between, and as the heart beats, the fluid in the pericardium reduces friction between the heart and its surroundings. Three layers make up the wall of the heart: the epicardium, which is actually part of the pericardium. So here we can see the epicardium is the inner or visceral pericardium. It's the serous membrane that is found on the very outside of the heart. The myocardium is all of this muscular middle layer. The myocardium is the part of the heart that actually beats to pump blood. And then last we have the endocardium. This is a smooth inner layer of epithelial tissue, and it helps blood flow smoothly through the heart. We've seen these prefixes before, so remember that epi is the outer covering, like in epidermis. Endo means inner, and then myo is muscle. The heart pumps blood around through two different circuits, and this picture sort of shows each of those separately. So we can see here that the pulmonary circuit goes from the heart over here on the right side of the heart, through the lungs, and then back to the heart. This is the loop where the blood picks up oxygen and drops off carbon dioxide. So the blood that's coming in to the right side of the heart is blue, meaning that it's oxygen poor. And so it's going to head over to the lungs via this pulmonary circuit, and it's going to pick up a bunch of oxygen in the lungs, and it's going to get rid of some of the metabolic waste that it's carrying, so carbon dioxide will diffuse out into the lungs. The blood then, once it's picked up its oxygen, goes back to the heart, and it goes in through the left side of the heart. The systemic loop is the path that blood follows when it goes from the left side of the heart out to the body. And so it's full of oxygen. It's just come from the lungs. It comes out to the body, drops off oxygen at all of the body tissues, picks up any carbon dioxide that the body tissues need to get rid of, and then heads back to the heart. The heart has four different internal chambers. It has two atria, and the atria are up top here. This is the right atrium. The left atrium is over here. And both atria receive blood. The blood coming in from either the lungs or from the body first enters the heart into the atrium. And then we have two ventricles as well. So there's the right ventricle here, left ventricle here. The ventricles are the part of the heart that are actually pumping blood. So these are the muscular chambers, and when they contract, they squeeze blood out to the body. There's a right and a left side to the heart as well. So over here we have the right atrium and right ventricle. These are going to be the two chambers that are pumping blood out to the pulmonary loop. So we can see that the little arrow is showing the blood coming up this way from the right side of the heart to the lungs. And then we have a left atrium and left ventricle, and those two chambers are responsible for pumping blood through the systemic loop, so pumping blood out to the rest of the body. This is a really simplified picture, so if you notice, it's got nothing above the heart except the lungs, and then the body is shown below the heart. The next picture essentially shows the same thing, but in a more realistic way. So we'll just kind of walk through this one a little bit separately. So again, here's our heart, and the right side of the heart is pumping blood out to the lungs, but of course we have two lungs, so the blood that's leaving the right side of the heart splits and heads off towards the right and the left lung. Capillary beds in the lungs are the location of gas exchange, so CO2 leaves the blood and goes into the lungs, and then oxygen goes into the blood. And that's happening here on the left lung and on the right lung. And all of that oxygenated blood goes back into the left atrium, where it's going to move into the left ventricle and get pumped out to the systemic loop. But the systemic loop is going to branch as well. So we can see there's one major branch of the systemic loop that's going to head upwards, which makes sense. Your arms and your head are above your heart, so blood has to get pumped. Some blood has to get pumped up towards those structures. And then also we're going to have a branch that brings oxygenated blood down to the rest of the body, so the trunk and the legs. There will be capillary beds at both ends of the systemic loop. So there's going to be capillary beds in the body and in the head and arms. And the same thing's going to happen in both of those. The body is going to be taking oxygen from the blood. So we can see here a little cluster of tissue cells. The oxygen is going to be leaving the bloodstream, going to the cells, and then the carbon dioxide that the cells are producing goes into the blood. That deoxygenated blood comes from the bottom of the body and from the top of the body into the right side of the heart again. So we have a cycle. Let's just walk through this one more time really quickly. So we've got blood that is oxygen poor, collecting from both the inferior and superior regions of the body. The oxygen poor blood goes into the right atrium, from there into the right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps blood out to both lungs, and then once the blood picks up oxygen at the lungs, it's returned into the left atrium. From the left atrium, blood goes to the left ventricle and then gets pumped out to the body. Some of it's going up towards the head and arms, some of it's going down towards the trunk and legs. Once that blood drops off its oxygen to the tissue cells, it heads back to the heart. Okay, in this picture we see another cross section of the heart, and this time we're going to be looking at some of the valves inside the heart. The heart is a pump, but it's a pump that only wants to pump in one direction, so there are valves to prevent backflow. Blood is only supposed to travel the path that we marked off on the last slide, and you would never want blood heading in the opposite direction. So valves essentially close off the pathway behind the blood so that it can't move backwards, it can only move forwards. There are two mitral valves, and these are the valves found in between the atrium and the ventricle. So blood enters the atrium, the mitral valves allow the blood to pass into the ventricle, and then they close so that when the ventricle contracts, blood can't flow back into the atrium. The tricuspid valve is the mitral valve that's on the right side of the heart, and then another mitral valve, the bicuspid, is over here on the left side. There are also two semilunar valves, and these separate the ventricles from the major blood vessels. So we can see here the right ventricle pumps blood out through the pulmonary valve. Blood leaves the right side of the heart to go to the lungs. This pulmonary semilunar valve will close so that once the blood has been pumped out, it can't flow back into the heart. There's also an aortic semilunar valve, and that is going to do a similar thing where blood coming from the left side of the heart is pushed out into the aorta and can't go back into the heart. This picture gives us a second look at some of those valves. Over here we have the view from above, and we can see that the bicuspid valve and the tricuspid valve are named as they are because of the number of sort of cusps that they have, or flaps. So the tricuspid has 3, bicuspid has 2. And then here are the 2 semilunar valves, the pulmonary valve, which again, blood's going to travel through on its way to the lungs, and the aortic valve, which blood travels through on its way out to the body. Notice that in the picture here above, when the pulmonary and aortic valves, when the semilunar valves are closed, the mitral valves are going to be open. So blood is flowing into the ventricles at this time. And then the mitral valves close, blood is trapped in the ventricles, and when the heart squeezes, that blood gets pushed out through the semilunar valves, so they are going to be the ones open at that time. To put this all together, I have a YouTube video. We'll just sort of switch over to that. It shows the path of blood through the heart, including the valves.
The heart is a pump which must circulate blood through 2 different but interconnected vascular systems. The smaller of these systems is the pulmonary system. Blood returning from the upper part of the body is delivered to the right atrium of the heart by the superior vena cava, one of the body's 2 largest veins, while blood returning from the lower part of the body is delivered to the right atrium by the other major vein, the inferior vena cava. Contraction of the right atrium in each cardiac cycle forces blood into the right ventricle. This is followed by contraction of the right ventricle, which pumps blood into the pulmonary artery, sending it on through the blood vessels of the lungs. As the right ventricle contracts and pressure within the right ventricle rises, the tricuspid valve situated at the opening between the right atrium and right ventricle shuts, preventing any backflow. The pressure generated by contraction of the right ventricle soon opens the pulmonary valve and blood enters the circulation of the lungs. After passing through the circulation of the lungs, the blood, having been recharged with oxygen and having rid itself of carbon dioxide, is returned through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium. The left atrium, too, contracts, forwarding blood into the left ventricle in order to fill it before it contracts. As the powerful left ventricle contracts, the mitral valve shuts, preventing backflow into the left atrium. The aortic valve opens, and blood is forced into the aorta, which distributes it to the rest of the body apart from the lungs. As the contraction comes to an end and pressure in the aorta falls, the aortic valve snaps shut to prevent backflow into the left ventricle.
The last thing I want to talk about in this presentation is cardiac circulation, and this is just a small branch of the circulatory system that actually nourishes the heart. So the heart is pumping blood, it's filled with blood constantly, but that blood isn't actually nourishing the heart tissue. There's a separate set of veins and arteries responsible for bringing blood to and from the heart muscle. So coronary arteries are the ones here in red that nourish the myocardium. They branch down from the aorta, and there are several. You don't need to learn the names of them, but they are seen here between the atrium and the ventricle, and then here between the right and left sides of the heart. These arteries fill when the heart is relaxed, and they compress when the heart contracts. So in other words, these arteries can only fill and can only have blood enter them when the heart is relaxed. If the heart rate is too fast for too long, you're going to decrease the amount of time that those arteries have to fill up with blood. That can cause something called angina pectoris, which is chest pain. And angina pectoris can be a symptom of a very serious problem because this reduced blood flow, if left long enough, can end up killing regions of heart cells. You end up with a small piece of heart tissue that is dead cells, and that's called an infarct. So another name for a heart attack is a myocardial infarction, meaning the myocardium, the muscles of the heart, develop an infarct. They develop a cluster of dead cells.